The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a cloud of Texas dust, and Elena Martinez clutched her worn carpet bag closer to her chest. The leather handles had grown soft from her nervous grip during the 3-day journey from San Antonio, and now they felt like the only solid thing in a world that had become suddenly terrifyingly uncertain. Through the small window she glimpsed the weathered buildings of Cedar Ridge, a frontier town that looked like it had been carved from the very earth itself, rough-hewn and determined to survive against all odds. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street, where a handful of cowboys lounged outside the saloon, their spurs catching the golden light as they shifted their weight against the wooden posts. Women in simple dresses hurried past with their heads down, their movements efficient and purposeful in the way of people who had learned to navigate a world where time was precious and danger could lurk around any corner. Elena watched them through the dust-streaked glass, wondering if she would ever move with such confidence again. "End of the line, ma'am," called the driver from his perch above. His voice was gruff but not unkind, weathered by years of calling out destinations to travelers who arrived in Cedar Ridge, seeking new beginnings or running from old endings. He had seen enough women like Elena to recognize the careful way she held herself, the way her eyes darted to check the street before stepping down, the protective curve of her shoulders. Elena's fingers trembled as she touched the fading bruise along her left cheekbone, a yellow-green reminder of Carlos's final rage. 3 weeks had passed since she'd fled San Antonio in the dead of night, moving like a ghost through the house that had become her prison, gathering only what she could carry and the small savings she'd hidden in the bottom of her sewing basket. The memory of that night still echoed in her bones, the sound of his heavy breathing in the bedroom, the creak of floorboards beneath her feet, the way her heart had hammered against her ribs as she'd eased the front door closed behind her. "You belong to me," he'd snarled during their last fight, his fist connecting with her jaw with a sound like breaking wood. "You'll never be free of me. No matter where you run, I'll find you." But she had run anyway, because staying meant dying a little more each day until nothing remained of the woman she'd once been. Elena had been 19 when she'd married Carlos. 19 and foolish enough to believe that his possessiveness was passion, that his jealousy was love. 12 years later, she knew better. She knew the difference between a man who loved you and a man who owned you, between protection and imprisonment, between strength and violence. The coach door swung open with a metallic groan, and Elena stepped down onto the dusty street. Her legs felt unsteady after the long journey, muscles cramped from sitting in the same position for hours, but she forced herself to stand straight. Independence meant more than just escaping. It meant learning to move through the world without apologizing for taking up space, without flinching at sudden movements, without calculating the mood of every man who looked in her direction. "Need help with anything else, ma'am?" The driver was already unloading her single bag from the top of the coach, his movements practiced and efficient. He'd been kind during the journey, offering her water during the heat of the day and an extra blanket when the desert nights grew cold. She wondered if he had a daughter somewhere, if that was why he'd been so careful with her, so gentle in his gruff way. "No, thank you." Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt. She pressed 2 silver coins into his weathered palm, more than the customary tip but less than the price of her freedom. "This is plenty." The driver touched his hat in acknowledgement and climbed back to his seat. "Good luck to you, ma'am," he said, and something in his tone suggested he understood more than he'd let on. Then he was gone, the stagecoach rolling away in another cloud of dust, leaving Elena truly alone for the first time in her adult life. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. She'd spent 12 years married to Carlos, 12 years of walking on eggshells, of measuring each word and movement against his unpredictable temper. Every decision had been filtered through the question of how he might react, what she wore, what she cooked, who she spoke to in the market. She'd learned to read the weather of his moods in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his coffee cup, the rhythm of his breathing when he slept. Now at 31 she was starting over with nothing but the clothes on her back and the $63 sewn into her corset. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Every coin had been earned through small deceptions, a penny saved here, a nickel hidden there, payment for sewing jobs that Carlos had never known about. She'd been planning her escape for 2 years, ever since the night he'd broken her wrist and then cried about it afterward, begging her forgiveness while she sat in stunned silence, cradling her injured arm. The town's main street stretched before her like a promise she didn't yet know how to keep. Buildings lined both sides of the wide dirt road. A general store with bolts of fabric displayed in the window, a boarding house with a hand-painted sign, a small church with a crooked steeple that spoke of frontier pragmatism over architectural perfection. Everything looked temporary, as if the next strong wind might blow it all away like tumbleweeds. But perhaps that was what she needed, a place where nothing was permanent, where she could disappear into the anonymity of the frontier. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that existed because of necessity rather than planning. It had grown up around the railroad depot and the nearby cattle ranches, a place where cowboys could spend their wages and ranchers could conduct business. The buildings were functional rather than beautiful, built to withstand the harsh Texas climate and the kind of rough living that came with frontier life. But there was something honest about it, something clean in its simplicity that appealed to Elena after years of living in Carlos's ornate house, where every piece of furniture had been chosen to impress rather than comfort. The boarding house sign creaked in the evening breeze. Mrs. Patterson's rooms, clean beds, Christian conduct. Elena approached the wooden steps, each footfall echoing in the quiet street. The porch was swept clean, with 2 rocking chairs positioned to catch the evening breeze. A hanging basket of wildflowers swayed gently, adding a touch of color to the weathered wood. Before she could knock, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a sensible bun, and kind eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize trouble when it arrived on her doorstep. "You must be the lady who sent the telegram," Mrs. Patterson said, wiping her hands on her apron. The gesture was automatic, the movement of someone who'd spent years caring for others. "Elena Martinez, wasn't it? Come in, child. You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." The boarding house interior was simple but clean, with lace curtains filtering the afternoon light and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Elena felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. No shouting, no heavy footsteps on the stairs, no need to gauge the atmosphere before speaking, just the quiet ticking of a mantel clock and the distant sound of horses in the street, the peaceful sounds of a place where violence was not the underlying current of daily life. "I have a room on the 2nd floor," Mrs. Patterson continued, leading Elena up a narrow staircase polished smooth by years of use. "Overlooks the main street so you can watch the comings and goings. Gets a bit noisy when the cowboys come to town on Saturday nights, but they're mostly harmless. Just boys blowing off steam after a week of hard work." The room was small but adequate, with a single bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that framed the Texas sky. Elena set her bag down on the bed and turned to face the landlady, who was studying her with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd seen plenty of women arrive in Cedar Ridge with secrets trailing behind them like shadows. "I'll need the first week's rent in advance," Mrs. Patterson said gently. $2 should cover it, meals included. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. I keep a Christian house, but I don't pry into folks' business unless they want to share." Elena reached into her bag and counted out the coins, her fingers still trembling slightly. "I'll be looking for work," she said. "I can sew and I know numbers. I kept books for my She stopped herself, the word catching in her throat like a fishbone. She wasn't ready to talk about Carlos. Wasn't ready to explain why a married woman was traveling alone. "I kept books before. There's always work for a woman who's handy with a needle," Mrs. Patterson replied, and Elena heard no judgment in her voice, only practical kindness. "The widow Thompson runs a dress shop 2 blocks down. She's been talking about needing help with the spring orders. Social season's coming up, and every woman in 3 counties will want a new dress for the big dance. As evening settled over Cedar Ridge, Elena stood at her window and watched the town transform. Lanterns flickered to life in the windows below, casting warm yellow squares of light onto the dusty street. She could hear the distant sound of piano music drifting from the saloon, accompanied by the low murmur of male voices and the occasional burst of laughter. It was the sound of men unwinding after a day of hard work, not the sound of violence or anger. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace, not the fragile quiet that had existed in Carlos's house, the kind of silence that could be shattered by a slammed door or a raised voice, but real peace. The kind that came from being in a place where no one expected anything from her, where no one was watching her every move for signs of disrespect or defiance. But just as she was about to turn away from the window, a commotion in the street caught her attention. A group of men on horseback had arrived, their horses snorting and pawing the ground, dust rising from their hooves. Even from her second-story window, Elena could tell these weren't ordinary cowboys. They sat their horses with the confidence of men who owned the land they rode across, who commanded respect without having to demand it. The man in the center commanded attention without saying a word. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his hat, and a presence that seemed to fill the entire street. When he dismounted, his movements were fluid and purposeful, like someone accustomed to being in charge but comfortable with the responsibility. He spoke quietly to his men, gesturing toward the general store, and Elena found herself straining to hear his voice. "That's Samuel Hartright, Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at Elena's shoulder with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to read her boarder's moods. "Owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties. Good man, though some folks find him intimidating. He's got that way about him. Commands respect without having to raise his voice." Elena watched as Samuel Hartright spoke quietly to his men, his voice too low to hear from her window, but there was something about the way he moved that caught her attention. Controlled, deliberate, but without the coiled tension she'd learned to fear in Carlos. This man's strength seemed to flow from confidence rather than anger, from capability rather than the need to dominate. "He's not married?" Elena asked, then immediately regretted the question. She had no business being curious about any man, especially one who clearly wielded considerable power. The last thing she needed was to fall into the trap of defining herself through another man's attention. "Widowed," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice softening. "Lost his wife in childbirth about 5 years ago. Beautiful woman Margaret was. Sweet as summer honey and twice as kind. Samuel took it harder than most men would have. Keeps to himself mostly now, though he's always been fair in his dealings. His ranch employs half the men in town, and he pays better wages than most." Elena found herself studying the man more closely. There was something in his posture, in the way he'd spoken to his men, that suggested strength without brutality. It was a foreign concept to her, but one that stirred something she thought had died during those long years of marriage. She'd forgotten that men could be strong without being violent, that authority could exist without cruelty. Samuel Hartright disappeared into the general store, his men following behind him or dispersing to their own errands. Elena stepped back from the window, disturbed by her own reaction to the sight of him. She had no intention of getting involved with another man, particularly one who probably expected the same kind of subservience Carlos had demanded. Her goal was simple: earn enough money to keep moving west until she found somewhere Carlos could never track her down. But as she prepared for bed that night, Elena found herself thinking about the cattle baron's quiet confidence. There had been something in his posture, in the way he'd spoken to his men, that suggested strength without brutality. It was a foreign concept to her, but one that stirred something she thought had died during those long years of marriage. She'd forgotten that power could be wielded gently, that leadership could exist without fear. The next morning, Elena woke to the sound of activity in the street below. Roosters crowing, horses whinnying, the rumble of wagon wheels on hard-packed earth. She dressed quickly in her best remaining dress, a simple blue cotton that had somehow escaped Carlos's jealous rages, and made her way downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was small but cheerful, with 4 tables covered in checkered cloth and windows that let in the morning light. 2 other boarders were already eating. An elderly man who introduced himself as Mr. Kemp, the town's barber, and a young woman named Mary who worked at the dress shop. Both welcomed her with the easy friendliness of people who understood that everyone in Cedar Ridge had come from somewhere else, that everyone had their own reasons for being here. "You're the new arrival," Mary said with a smile that reached her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might be looking for work." Mrs. Thompson could certainly use the help, especially with the spring social coming up. That's when the whole town comes together for dancing and music and the biggest feast you ever saw. Elena felt a flutter of something she didn't recognize at first. Hope, maybe, or anticipation. A social? The whole town comes out for it, Mary explained, her face lighting up with enthusiasm. Dancing, food, music. It's the biggest event of the season. Mrs. Thompson always gets orders for new dresses, and this year she's been overwhelmed. Half the ladies in the county want something new to wear. After breakfast, Elena walked with Mary to the dress shop, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. The morning air was crisp and clean, so different from the stifling heat of San Antonio. Cedar Ridge was waking up around them, shopkeepers opening their doors, children running to school with books clutched under their arms, horses clopping down the main street carrying riders to ranches and farms scattered across the countryside. The dress shop was a small building with a hand-painted sign and a window display of beautiful fabrics in every color imaginable, silks and cottons, woolens and linens, all arranged to catch the light and draw the eye. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from her sewing machine as they entered. "This is Elena Martinez," Mary said. "She's looking for work and she knows how to sew." Mrs. Thompson studied Elena with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years fitting women into dresses, reading their personalities in their posture and their needs in their expressions. "Can you do more than just mend?" she asked. "I need someone who can handle complicated alterations and maybe even help with some of the simpler designs. The social's only 3 weeks away, and I've got more orders than I can handle." Elena nodded, feeling more confident than she had in years. "I made most of my own clothes for years. I can work with patterns and I'm good with delicate fabrics. I know how to fit a dress so it flatters the wearer, not just covers her." "Show me," Mrs. Thompson said, gesturing to a partially finished dress on the counter. "I need this taken in at the waist and the sleeves shortened. The lady it's for is smaller than I expected." Elena examined the garment, a lovely green silk that would suit a woman of means. She could see immediately what needed to be done and how to do it without damaging the fabric or distorting the design. Working carefully, she pinned the alterations, her fingers moving with the confidence of long practice. This was something she knew how to do, something that belonged to her alone. "That's exactly right," Mrs. Thompson said with approval. "You've got a good eye for proportions. When can you start?" "Right now if you need me to." As Elena settled into her first day of work, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being valued for her skills, rather than merely tolerated. Mrs. Thompson treated her as an equal, asking for her opinions on fabric choices and trusting her with increasingly complex tasks. For the first time since leaving San Antonio, Elena began to believe that she might actually build a life here, that she might become someone other than Carlos's wife. The morning passed quickly, filled with the steady rhythm of sewing and the comfortable chatter of women working together. Elena learned about the town's rhythms, about the families who lived here, and the challenges they faced. Mrs. Thompson was a widow herself, her husband having died in a farming accident 3 years earlier. She'd opened the dress shop, partly out of necessity, and partly out of love for beautiful things. "It's not always easy," Mrs. Thompson said, as they worked side by side. "But it's mine. That counts for something." Elena understood completely. The freedom to make her own choices, to set her own pace, to create beauty instead of walking on eggshells. It was worth more than security, more than comfort, more than the illusion of protection that had kept her trapped for so long. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, and Elena began to understand the rhythm of small-town life. Unlike San Antonio, where she'd been isolated in Carlos's house, Cedar Ridge felt like a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, but also where people looked out for one another. Women stopped to chat about their children, about their husbands' work, about the weather and the crops and the 100 small concerns that made up daily life. Each customer brought her own story, her own needs. Mrs. Reynolds, the banker's wife, needed a dress for a formal dinner. Young Sarah Mitchell wanted something pretty for the social, something that would catch the eye of the blacksmith's son. The widow Henderson needed mourning clothes that were respectful but not so severe as to frighten away the companionship she craved. As closing time approached, Elena was finishing up a delicate hemming job when she heard the sound of hoofbeats outside. Through the window, she saw Samuel Hartright dismounting from his horse, his movements as fluid and controlled as they'd been the night before. He was even more imposing up close, with weathered hands that spoke of hard work and eyes the color of storm clouds. The shop door opened and he stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. "Good evening, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I believe you have something for me?" "Of course, Mr. Hartright. Let me get it for you." Elena kept her head down, focusing on her stitching, but she was acutely aware of his presence. Unlike Carlos, who had filled every room with nervous energy and potential anger, Samuel Hartright's presence was steady and calming. He didn't need to dominate the space. He simply inhabited it with quiet confidence. "You must be the new seamstress," he said, and Elena looked up to find him studying her with curious but respectful eyes. "I'm Samuel Hartright, Elena Martinez," she replied, setting down her needle. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun, the calluses on his hands that came from real work. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge." His gaze lingered on her face, and she wondered if he could see the fading traces of the bruises she'd worked so hard to conceal. But there was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet understanding that made her feel seen without being exposed. "I hope you'll find our town to your liking." Mrs. Thompson returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Your sister's birthday gift," she said. "I think she'll be pleased with the color." Samuel thanked her, then turned back to Elena. "I hope you'll find our town to your liking," he repeated. "It's a good place for someone looking to start over." The words were simple, but something in his tone suggested he understood more than he was saying. Elena felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Not fear, but anticipation. Not the desperate hope of someone seeking rescue, but the quiet excitement of someone who might, just might, have found a place where she belonged. After he left, Mrs. Thompson looked at Elena with a knowing smile. "That man has been alone too long," she said. "And you, my dear, have had enough loneliness for one lifetime. Sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them." Elena didn't trust herself to respond. As she walked back to the boarding house that evening, she found herself thinking about Samuel Hartright's quiet strength and the way he'd looked at her, not as an object to be possessed, but as a person worthy of respect. It was a new feeling, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Elena allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to build a life here. Not as Carlos's wife, not as someone defined by her past, but as Elena Martinez, a woman starting over in a town where gentle strength might be possible, where kindness might not be a trap, where she might finally learn what it meant to be loved rather than owned. The evening sky stretched endlessly above the Texas plains, painted in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the watercolors she used to paint as a child. As Elena stood at her window, watching the sun set over her new home, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone seeking escape, but the quiet hope of someone who might have found a place where she could finally be herself.